In the last lecture, we have already discussed some of the challenges associated with applying artificial intelligence in the context of Earth observation. In this lecture, we will start discussing about the different learning paradigms, and when discussing, we will understand how some of these learning paradigms might be more useful to solve some of those challenges that we had already discussed, whereas some other learning paradigms or architectures might be more suitable for some other challenges. So we'll start our discussion from supervised learning. In supervised learning, we have 4 components: training data, a learner, a learning algorithm, and a performance indicator. How these 4 components are useful? Let us see more about this. So the training data, this can be input features, associated target, or the feedback. So in the last lecture, we already talked about images and labeling, and we took an example that how the annotation sometimes might be challenging, right? Then we have the learner. You can think about this as like a parameters as theta. Then we have the learning algorithm itself, which changes these parameters in order to improve the performance. The performance itself will be indicated by some cost function, right? So the learning process will go through an iteration of predict, score, and learn, right? So in this, we follow this pattern, right? So this concept of learning, this can also be just learning a classifier where we are feeding the features. So we are talking more in the context of the images right now. Of course, it can be other kind of data. Let's say we process the images somehow to get some features, and we feed this to the classifier. So we are not learning the features itself. Whereas it can also be the case that we are also learning the feature itself. So feature learning and the learning the classifier, this is happening simultaneously. So an open question, of course, is this like learning the feature and the classifier simultaneously? Is it necessarily better than previous one, where we extracted some features, handcrafted features somehow, and applied a classifier or learned a classifier on the top of this? If you think about this, answering this question itself depends on several factors like availability of training data and other aspects. So we will start architecture wise, we start discussing about the convolutional neural networks or CNNs. We will not discuss the basics of convolution in this course. If you're not familiar with the basics of convolution, I suggest that you can refer to one of the textbooks and get a basic from there before starting with the rest of this lecture. We will start talking about some popular architectures in the context of CNNs. So the first architecture we talk about is LeNet or LeNet 5, which was proposed around 1998 in the context of, let's say, 32 cross 32 image classification. So at that point of time, this was the image of our interest, let's say. And in this slide, what you see is not the entire architecture, rather the progression of the feature maps in some of the layers. So almost all the layers I've covered. There are a couple of more classification fully connected layers, which we have skipped here in this picture. However, we see is that given the 32 cross 32 input image, we progress to a feature map of dimension 28 cross 28 cross 6. From there, we are progressing to the feature map of 14 cross 14 cross 6 dimension. From there again, we are progressing to feature maps of dimension 10 cross 10 cross 16, right? So how is this happening? Let us try to understand this a bit better. So the first progression from the input image to the first feature maps that you are seeing is happening with convolution layers that is using kernel size 5 cross 5, stride 1. It's not using any padding, and the number of filters that are used is 6. That is why in the feature maps we see the dimension is 28 cross 28 cross 6. So we can also compute, if you want, we can also compute parameters at this stage. The parameter computation will go like this: 6 cross 5 cross 5 cross 1 plus 6 for the bias, and we get 156 parameters. The next level of progression happens with a subsampling layer, a variant of average pooling, and we are getting 14 cross 14 cross 6 feature map. So we see that number of feature map, this is not changing at this stage. And from here, we are now moving to 10 cross 10 cross 16 feature maps. So this, in the original LeNet 5 version, this was achieved using a convolution layer that interestingly uses partial connectivity. The kernel size was again 5 cross 5. Output feature maps is 16 and input feature maps is 6. So the output size, as we already mentioned, is 10 cross 10 cross 16. The partial connectivity pattern is like this: 6 of the maps connect to 3 input maps, 6 other maps connects to 4 input maps, 3 maps connects to 4 non-consecutive input maps, and there is 1 map which is connected to all 6 input maps. And in this way, there are a couple of more layers, right? So this is LeNet 5, which had very few layers compared to the architectures if you see today. Now, let us try to, so as I said that the LeNet 5 was proposed in the late 90s, right? So let us try to understand what was happening in between the 2001 to 2010, this era in remote sensing classification. So what I'm showing you here is a search with the string remote sensing classification. I've not tried to optimize this, so it just a search with the string remote sensing classification on Google Scholar. And what we see is that, so as you can see that the time period, this has been modified to fit 2001 to 2010, right? And let us have a look at some of the top papers that is shown to us. So we see the first paper is talking about random forest classifier. The second paper is talking about support vector machines. Similarly, the fourth paper is again talking about support vector machines. So these are like, we'll see like there was a strong dominance of support vector machines during this era, and there were some other some other methods used sometimes. So this was an era like where the methodology most of the times dependent on extraction of the features and then using one of these classifiers, whereas after 2010, I would say in the context of remote sensing, it was not even just 2010, maybe around 2014-15 only, the adoption of modern convolution neural networks started. So before talking about or thinking about adoption of modern CNNs in remote sensing, maybe we would first like to understand their adoption in the computer vision, right? So in this particular example I'm showing you from the remote sensing classification, but even if you search with, let's say, some medical image classification or just generic computer vision image classification also, between 2001 to 2010, you will see the similar trend. To break these trends, several important developments were important that happened in this decade, like improvement in the GPU technology, or also improvement in the dataset availability. So if you don't really have large scale datasets available, you cannot really train, like large scale models. And an interesting development happened in 2010, more in the computer vision domain. The ImageNet Large Scale Visual Recognition Challenge 2010, this released a quite large data set with 1,000 object categories. And interestingly, the very first version of this challenge, if we look at the winners, most of the top teams still used a feature extraction plus support vector machine pipeline. However, subsequently, with respect to this specific data set, CNN started performing better, and that gave the entire community to, from now onwards, start using CNN based architectures. So here what we see is AlexNet from 2011-2012. And what we see is that given an input image size which is much larger with respect to the image size that we were discussing before in the context of LeNet, right? And what we are getting is a feature map of 55 cross 55 cross 48 plus 48, right? So this AlexNet, this revolutionized use of the CNNs in computer vision and subsequently also in the Earth observation. So we'll discuss about some of the interesting characteristics of AlexNet. One of the quite interesting characteristics that the AlexNet paper emphasized quite a lot is that the initial layer uses 11 cross 11 filters. Even though this particular practice was later discontinued in the later architectures, the AlexNet work emphasized that using these large filters leads to a large receptive field, which they hypothesized leads to better performance. As we already saw in the figure, right, the original architecture of the AlexNet, this is divided into two distinct parts. So this is a design choice influenced by the limited memory capacity of the GPUs back then. As a result, the network's architecture split into two GPUs. So this is the rest of the architecture, as you see, like uses some more convolution layers, and there are other post-processing layers or functions in between. So we'll discuss about some of them briefly. So what we see in the AlexNet is that there are 5 convolution and 3 fully connected layers. And we already saw that the first convolutional layer uses 96 kernels of size 11 cross 11, right? And as we said, that these large filters allowed the network to capture complex and high-level features from the images. The subsequent convolution layers uses smaller kernels. AlexNet also further used dropout, ReLU activation, max pooling. So instead of a version of average pooling which was previously used in LeNet, it's started using max pooling. We'll not discuss all of this in details at this point. However, let us briefly touch on dropout. So the dropout, the idea is that to make each hidden unit more robust and drive it towards creating useful features on its own without relying on the other hidden units to correct its mistake. So some of the, as you see, that some of the neurons are randomly dropped. So you can specify a percentage of neurons to be dropped. And generally, there is an exception. The exception we won't discuss right now. But generally, our assumption is that this dropout will be applying during training only. Similarly, AlexNet also advocated for extensive data augmentation. They say that this is a way to reduce overfitting, and data augmentation since then, as we'll see in this course many times, this has becomes this has become common, and not just this has become a norm. This has been cleverly used in some of the learning paradigms that we will discuss later. The assumption behind data augmentation is that certain transformation do not really modify the class of the image, and this leads to the availability of more data that results in better training. So let us move ahead from the AlexNet and let us talk about a few more architectures. Continuing on the example set by AlexNet, VGGNet was proposed in 2014. However, remarkably, VGGNet did not go for 11 cross 11 convolution filters that we discussed before. It rather promoted the use of 3 cross 3 convolution filters. It suggested that maintaining a constant convolution filter size across all layers and simply increasing the depth of the CNN. Okay, so the idea is that, okay, you don't need this engineering in the terms of different convolution filter size, kernel size. Rather, you could just simply increase the depth of the CNN, and this would lead to improvement in performance for visual recognition tasks. So their study also suggested that although VGGNet has more layers and a large number of parameters compared to the previous models, it requires fewer epochs for training. So this phenomenon can be partially attributed to the effect of the smaller filter sizes, while they also use pre-initialized weights that also played a significant role. Now, standing at this point of time, maybe the most natural question to ask would be whether we can just go deeper with the models, or the architectures should innovate in other directions as well, right? Like as we just discussed in the context of VGGNet. The VGGNet suggested that some of the engineerings as proposed by especially the kernel size, right? Initial layer kernel size. This type of engineering is not needed, and VGGNet suggested that, okay, why not let's just go deeper and we would get better performance. So at this point of time, the question is that, okay, should we then just keep going deeper and we should stop innovating in other directions? The obvious answer is, of course, no, because if the answer was yes, probably there was no point of any more deep learning, designing new deep learning architectures, right? So one of the development that we see almost from the contemporary time is this Inception modules. Inception module is not the entire architecture. You can stack Inception modules one after other. However, the main idea that we would like to discuss here is the capturing of multi-scale features. So what we see is that given the input from the previous layer, how we are progressing to the next layer, we are initially processing through 1 cross 1 convolutions, so that we can skip discussing at this point of time why you use 1 cross 1 convolution. This will be clear later in some other discussions. However, what we see clearly is that from the previous layer to the next layer, we have convolution of different filter size, right? So this helps to capture multi-scale context. Now, of course, you can still go deeper with this kind of modules. So that's not a direction we are stopping at, but however, in the individual layer or module itself, we have right now innovated in a different manner. And capturing of the multi-scale information, this becomes much important when we will later talk about semantic segmentation, let's say. So, building on this question that we just asked ourselves, that whether we just stop innovating, we of course saw right now that no, we just don't stop innovating. Simply, at the same time, another obvious question to ask ourselves would be, is it even beneficial to go deeper? That is, if we just, let's say, keep on increasing layers after layers, would that mean that we obtain better performance? So there, you can think also this problem in this manner, that you are going from shallow to deeper network, right? So consider a shallower architecture and its deeper counterpart that simply adds more layers onto it. A simple way to construct such a deeper network would be just adding extra layers that simply implement, let's say, identity mappings, while, let's say, the remaining layers replicate just the shallower model. So what would happen in principle? Such a deeper model should achieve no worse training error than its like shallower counterpart, right? However, does it hold true? Does a deeper model just, if we train a deeper model, actually, does it always perform better or at least as good as its shallower version? So what happened is, in the very famous work or paper which goes by the name ResNet right now, this was shown that this is not really the case. Just simply adding layers doesn't help, and sometimes actually the performance degrades. And in this context, this paper, the ResNet, they introduced residual block, where the idea was given an input. Okay, so this given an input at a particular stage, you are processing it through particular convolution, residual, and other layers, right? And you add back the input. Okay, so by using such residual block, they showed that the performance indeed now, like by just adding layers, indeed to some extent, still I won't say it's perfect, but to some extent it the performance improves or at least saturates compared to like the architectures before, where the performance even started dropping. So we'll stop here in this lecture right now, and from here we'll take forward our discussion on further architectures and learning paradigms in the next lecture. Thank you.